Hello and welcome to a video in my Hearthstone concept series. Today we're going to be talking about a concept called the mana curve. So let's jump right in. We'll have a look at the collection here. So first of all, what is a mana curve and where can I see it? So if you click on a deck in your collection, you hover over the name, you can see this graph that appears. So this is your mana curve. So I'm just going to freeze this here and we'll take a different view. Okay, so here's a closer look in my high-tech editing suite of Microsoft Paint. So let's describe actually what this mana curve is showing us. So at the bottom we have some mana values, 0 to 7 plus, and then we have some bars above each value. So the bars above each value tell us how many cards are in the deck that have that mana cost. So in this deck I've got 4 cards that cost 1 mana, 6 cards that cost 2 mana, 6 cards that cost 3 mana, and so on. So the mana curve actually dictates how many cards you can play at each stage of the game. So whenever the game starts, both players have 1 mana and you can only play cards that cost 1 mana or less. Whenever the next turn happens, each player gains a mana crystal, so you can only play cards that cost 2 mana or 1 mana or less. And this kind of means that the cards towards the later end of the mana curve also correspond to the later stages of a game. So the more cards you have towards the start of the curve, the more you can play early in the game. So there are two broad types of mana curve representing those, so we'll talk about those a little bit. So the first type of deck we'll think about is one that's called a fast deck. And a fast deck is a deck that's designed to be able to play a lot of low cost cards very quickly. And the ultimate goal of a fast deck is normally to win the game during the early stages. So if you were going to look at the mana curve for a fast deck, you would see it would rise very sharply and it would also fall very sharply towards the end of the mana curve. So a deck like this is what would be called a fast deck. So kind of similarly, there is another type of deck called a slow deck, and a slower deck would be a deck that plays less cards so quickly early on, but it would play more cards towards the end of the game. So the objective of a deck like this would probably be to do something like control your opponent until the late game. So the mana curve for a slow deck would rise more slowly and it would peak towards the end game more. So basically you're not trying to put on aggression in this early stage, you're just trying to hold your opponent off and survive until the late game, and you try and win with your bigger cards towards the end. So then the question arises, having looked at slow decks and fast decks, the question is what's a curve for a good deck? What does a good mana curve look like? And the answer to that question is that there isn't really an answer. What makes a good mana curve really depends on the cards in your deck. So take for example, there's a popular deck for the Warlock class which uses Murlocs. It's the Warlock Murloc deck, which is a bit of a tongue twister. The object of this deck is to win early. So if you were to look at a curve for a deck like that, it would be a very, very, very fast curve. This type of curve here would actually be a good curve for that deck, because the objective of that deck is to win the game early, and if you make it to this late game, you've actually missed your objective, so there's no point in having any late game cards in that deck. Late game cards don't really sit with the goal of that deck. So what makes a good curve actually depends on the goal of your deck and the cards in the deck. So taking again that example of the Warlock Murloc deck, it has a lot of really fast Murloc cards, and the Murloc cards synergize really well with each other. So the more fast Murloc cards you have in your deck, the better your other fast Murloc cards actually get. So for a deck like that, this would actually be quite a good curve. So we've talked a bit about how there might not be the one good mana curve, but it would still be possible to have a generally good mana curve. So your intuition for what that might look like could be something like this, like a bell curve that would rise nice and slowly, peak in the middle, and then smoothly drop off towards the end. And that wouldn't be a bad intuition, and that would probably be a pretty decent curve for a lot of decks. So one other thing to think about is the utility of your cards. So when I'm in the early game and I have 1, 2 or 3 mana, I can play my 0, 1, 2 or 3 mana cards. And when I'm in the late game and I have 4, 5, 6, 7 and beyond mana, I can play these 4, 5, 6, 7 and beyond mana cards. However, I can also still play my 0, 1, 2 and 3 cards. So these low mana cost cards still have utility in the late game, whereas the cards from the late game, they don't have utility in the early game because I can't yet play them. So what does that then mean for our good curve? We might be able to shift our good curve slightly further forwards. So it might look like this. It might rise a little faster, peak a little earlier, and then fall off a little faster as well. So this green curve might be a little closer to what would be a good curve, having considered the utility of our cards. You might be thinking then that you should consider the probability of being able to play cards, and it's kind of based on the draw mechanics in the game. So you might be thinking, well, if I can only play my low cost drops in my first few turns, do I then need to flood my deck with low cost cards to make sure that I get something to play in the first few turns? Is that the case? Partially that's true, but there are a couple of ways that the game helps you to balance out where you get your cards. So the first one of these is the Mulligan Phase. So you get assigned a set of cards initially. However, if there's cards in there that you don't want to keep that you think are better for the late game, you can actually discard those and draw again. So whilst you're not guaranteed to get cards that you can play in the first couple of turns, the fact that you have some sort of input over the probability, it does kind of help even things out, so you don't have to completely flood your deck with low cost cards. And another interesting point this brings up, because you've influenced the probability of getting your early game cards in the early game, it means that as you approach the late game, you've got less cards in your deck, and a lot of your early game cards have already been played from your deck, which means that you actually have a higher probability of pulling your late game cards in the late game. So whilst the Mulligan Phase does help even out your card distribution across the phase of a game, it still is the case that you do need a couple more low cost minions, generally to increase the probability that you have a nice consistent way to play some drops on your first couple of turns. And that would be another reason why the sort of slightly faster green curve would generally be better when you consider the draw mechanics and probability as well. Okay, and another point to consider is a scenario. So let's say that we have 6 mana. So it says here, it's 6 mana. So we have a choice of actions to take here. We could maybe play one card that costs 6 mana. We could actually play 2 cards that cost 3 mana, or 3 cards that cost 2 mana, or some combination that adds up to 6 mana, but with different numbers of cards. So in between turns in the game, you get the opportunity to draw one card. If you make it to the late game and you have early game cards, you're going to want to be playing more than one card per turn. So you're actually falling behind on the number of cards you have because you're playing more than you're receiving. And this is bad because it means you're falling behind on options to respond to your opponent, and it probably means that if you start to run out of cards, you won't be able to make use of your mana. So the key to kind of fighting this drop off in cards you have is to add card draw to your deck. And card draw takes the form of any sort of card that can allow you to pull more cards from your deck, more than just the one that you get every turn. So something like Cult Master might allow you to do that. We don't have an Arcane Intellect in this deck. Acolyte of Pain, anything like that. Any cards like that that allow you to pull cards. Gadgetzan Auctioneer is another one. Basically, any card that lets you get more cards in than the one you normally would. This allows you to spend more than one card per turn and still be able to make good plays. Now, how this relates to the mana curve is that, generally speaking, the earlier your curve peaks, the more card draw you need in your deck, because the earlier your curve peaks means the more small drops you have, which means the more cards you'll be able to play per turn as you move up to the late game, and the more draw you have, the later you'll be able to sustain this repeated cycle of playing more cards than you're getting in without draw. So one point to note here is the Warlock's hero ability, the Warlock's hero power. Allows you to pay 2 life and draw a card, and this is probably why it was chosen as the class to use with the Murloc deck, because the Murloc deck is a very, very, very fast deck that has an awful lot of low cost cards, and the Warlock's hero ability complements that really well by ensuring that you can actually get 2 cards really reliably at least per turn, even if you don't have any additional draw in your deck. So that allows you to play a lot more cards very quickly. So that's just a quick point on how card draw relates to your mana curve. Okay, so let's just clean this up a little bit and have a quick summary of what we've talked about the mana curve. So basically we said that the mana curve controls the strength of your deck throughout the phases of the game. Slower mana curves, which have later peaks, generally mean your deck's stronger in the later game, and vice versa. And in terms of what makes a good mana curve, we've kind of talked about how it's generally better to have more drops towards the start of your curve than towards the middle, because these drops retain their utility throughout the entire game. And another side note on that is that the earlier you move the curve, the more you have to incorporate card draw into your deck. So that's about it for the mana curve, and thanks very much for watching.